Hello everyone, welcome. It's a bit loud. So welcome to the second of two lectures by Professor Hugh Urban. For those of you who were here last night, you'll remember Professor Urban's wonderful talk on Osho, and today I think we're going to have a different kind of a conversation, but one that's equally, if not more interesting. So I'm just going to read out the bio again in the form of a kind of formal introduction. And so Professor Hugh Urban is Professor of Religious Studies and South Asian Studies in the Department of Comparative Studies at Ohio State University. He's primarily interested in Tantra and in the complex interactions between Tantra and new religious currents in America and Europe. He's the author of 7 books, including Tantra, Sex, Secrecy, Politics, and Power in the Study of Religions, 2003, Magia Sexualis, Sex, Magic, and Liberation in Modern Western Esotericism, 2005, The Power of Tantra, Religion, Sexuality, and the Politics of South Asian Studies, 2010, The Church of Scientology, A History of a New Religion, 2011, and most recently, Zorba the Buddha, Sex, Spirituality, and Capitalism in the Global Osho Movement, 2016. So today we're going to hear a little bit from his research on Scientology, and very much look forward to it. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to come and talk about some of my work with you this evening. I'm genuinely honored and flattered to be here, so thank you all for coming, especially for those of you who came last night and I guess didn't get enough of Hugh Urban or something. So Professor Sonaji asked me if I would speak on some of my recent work on the Church of Scientology, so I'm happy for the opportunity to present some of that research and receive a bit of critical feedback from you all. So the title of my paper today is The Wall of Fire, the Church of Scientology and the Study of Religious Secrecy. And here I'm going to focus on just one particular aspect of secrecy in this controversial new religious movement, since there are obviously many, many, many things one can talk about in the case of Scientology. The phrase wall of fire here refers to one of the most advanced, most confidential, but ironically one of the least studied aspects of Scientology training that I'll be discussing in my talk today. First, just let me say a few words about myself and my broader research. So, as Professor Sonaji said, I have multiple areas of research. One is Hindu Tantra in South Asia, mainly Northeast India, which is a tradition that deals in large part with secrecy and esotericism. I've written several books about Tantra in Northeast India. The other area I work on is new religious movements in the United States. I recently did a book on Scientology, and this is in part the material that I'll be building upon here today. And then finally, I'm now working on another comparative and theoretical book on religion and secrecy, which will examine a number of different modes of secrecy in different historical contexts. So I'm very happy to have the chance to try out some of my ideas with you all here today and receive your comments, thoughts, and suggestions as I continue to develop that project. So why the Church of Scientology? Why, you may wonder, am I focusing on this particular movement for my talk today? Well, secrecy in many different forms has been a central preoccupation for Scientology from its inception, and it continues to this day. The founder of the church, L. Ron Hubbard, was quite secretive about his own biography, and it later turned out that much of what he had said about his life turned out to be false. He also spent much of his life in hiding, particularly during his final years when he was wanted by the FBI. Scientology was also highly concerned with internal surveillance, and in the early 1960s developed a practice called security checks, which were designed to identify potentially subversive members within the organization. The church also had its own sophisticated intelligence bureau called the Guardian's Office that was engaged in fairly remarkable acts of espionage, including the infiltration of the IRS and other agencies during the 1970s. Indeed, in my book, I argued that Scientology during its first few decades was in many ways a kind of Cold War religion. That is, it reflected and often epitomized larger concerns with secrecy, information control, and surveillance that pervaded the United States during the 1950s and 60s. And then finally, Scientology also developed highly esoteric levels of advanced training called the operating thetan levels, or the OT levels. And these will be the primary focus of my talk today. I just want to make it clear that there are many, many different forms of secrecy in this complex movement, each of which would require a different methodology and a different theoretical approach. I'm only going to talk about one of these in my brief presentation today, but I'd be happy to talk about any of the others in more detail afterward for those who are interested. So one of the primary theoretical questions that I'm really interested in is what I call the ethical and epistemological double bind of secrecy. By this I mean the following questions. First, how can an outsider ever really know the content of a tradition that is secret or closed to non-members? And second, should one even try? Even if one were an insider, could one in good conscience reveal those secrets to a broader public audience? Moreover, is the very attempt to penetrate the secrets of another tradition itself an act of violence? That is a form of intellectual imperialism or cultural theft. Well, I don't think there's any easy way out of this ethical epistemological double bind. I would suggest there are some alternative strategies for dealing with it. In the case of Scientology's advanced OT materials, at least, I would suggest that we sort of shift our gaze away from the content of the secret, which we will see in my talk is both epistemologically and ethically problematic, and instead focus on the more visible forms and strategies through which secret knowledge is revealed and concealed. While we can't say that much with certainty about the content, I will argue, we can say quite a lot about the forms and strategies through which secret information is partially displayed and largely obfuscated, advertised and withdrawn, the ways in which sort of the aura of secrecy is constructed, transmitted, and protected. And what I'm going to do is I'll attempt to retrace the history of a secret by pursuing 5 historical moments and 5 strategies through which Scientology's esoteric knowledge was constructed and transmitted from the late 1960s to the present. Now, there is, of course, a large body of good scholarship on secrecy and religion. There's the fine work on Western esotericism, pioneered by people like Anton Fevre and Wouter Hanegraaff. And there are many important studies of secrecy from an ethnographic and anthropological perspective. However, for the sake of my brief talk, I'm going to borrow some insights from sociologists such as Georg Simmel and Pierre Bourdieu, while also adapting them somewhat by retracing the complex, shifting historical role of Scientology's secrets during these 5 decades. And then finally, to conclude, I'll suggest that this particular case of Scientology offers some broader theoretical insights into the study of religious secrecy in a comparative context. So, I want to begin with just a few very brief words by way of background. As probably most of you know, Scientology's founder was L. Ron Hubbard, who was born in Tilden, Nebraska in 1911. In his early years, Hubbard made his career as one of the most, if not the most, prolific authors of science fiction, fantasy, and adventure tales during the 1930s and 40s, the golden age of science fiction, publishing hundreds of pulp fiction stories and novels. Indeed, he wrote so much and so quickly that he was forced to publish under an array of pseudonyms, such as Winchester Remington Colt, René Lafayette, Legionnaire 148, and many, many others. As more than one observer has pointed out, there are many continuities between Hubbard's early science fiction tales and his later Scientology writings, which also include large amounts of what Hubbard called space opera material, that is, discussions of life on other planets, alien races, and the past history of the universe, going back billions and even trillions of years. It's also worth mentioning that Hubbard had a keen interest in occultism, magic, and paranormal phenomena, which appear as frequent themes in many of his early stories. Following his career in the Navy during World War II, in fact, Hubbard became extremely involved in a series of magical rituals with a young engineer and rocket scientist named Jack Parsons in Southern California. And this episode, I should note, remains one of the most controversial and much debated periods in Hubbard's already controversial biography, but I'm mentioning it because I'm going to come back to these themes toward the end of my talk. So Jack Parsons was a student of the work of Aleister Crowley, who is arguably the most important figure in the revival of occultism and magic in the 20th century, and Parsons was a member of Crowley's magical group, the Ordo Templi Orientis. Parsons was in fact performing a series of rituals called the Babylon Working that had as their aim the creation of a magical child or moon child, which was supposed to be a supernatural offspring that would become the embodiment of ultimate power. So the rite was intended to first identify a woman who would serve as Parsons' partner in esoteric rites, and ultimately as the incarnation of Lady Babylon, who would in turn become impregnated with this magical child of ultimate power. According to Parsons' records from March of 1946, L. Ron Hubbard was an intimate participant in the Babylon Working and even acted as the scribe, or the voice for Lady Babylon herself, who spoke through him during these rites. Perhaps the most remarkable part of this whole story about Hubbard, Parsons, and secret magical rites is that the Church of Scientology actually acknowledged that all of this really did happen. In an article published in the London Sunday Times in 1969, which is down here on the bottom right, the church claimed that these rites actually did take place, but that Hubbard had been sent in on a special military mission in order to break up this secret black magic group. This he successfully did, the church reported, by rescuing the girl who was involved and shutting down this occult operation. It's worth noting, however, that neither the Church of Scientology nor any independent researcher has provided any evidence for this claim. But in any case, whether or not Hubbard really was engaged seriously in these occult rituals, or whether he was sent in as some kind of secret military agent, this incident is worth keeping in mind for the latter part of my talk. As we'll see as we go on, there's today tremendous debate as to whether or not these occult themes reappeared in Hubbard's later writings on Scientology, including the advanced operating Thetan materials that I'm going to be discussing in a few minutes. Now, in 1950, Hubbard turned his attention from science fiction to what he dubbed a new science of the human mind called Dianetics. And Dianetics first appeared in a science fiction magazine called Astounding Science Fiction in 1950, and then later in book form that same year. Derived from the Greek words dia and nous, meaning through the mind, Dianetics claimed that all of our problems come through the mind, and therefore that all of the solutions to our problems can be resolved through a proper understanding of the mind as well. Dianetics was a hugely but briefly successful movement in the years 1950 and 1951. Indeed, it was really the first great American self-help book and pop psychology manual, which leapt to the top of the New York Times bestseller list and remained there for many, many weeks, spawning a kind of Dianetics craze across the United States. But the initial fervor of Dianetics as a fad quickly fizzled and went bankrupt by 1952. However, it was quickly replaced by a new and explicitly religious movement, which Hubbard called the Church of Scientology and formally incorporated in 1953. So both the early Dianetics movement and the later Church of Scientology use a basic technique called auditing, in which an individual works with a trained counselor called an auditor to identify areas of unconscious pain and trauma, which are called engrams. Auditing involves the use of a device called the e-meter or electropsychometer, which works much like a lie detector and is designed to help the auditor identify problem areas and painful memories in the mind by asking questions and observing the reactions on the meter. So John Travolta here is the one being audited, holding the cylinders on the e-meter, and then to the right there would be the auditor who's reading the measurements on the meter. Once these problem areas and negative memory traces, or engrams, have been identified and talked through with the auditor, they are cleared from the mind, and when all of one's negative memory traces have been identified and examined, one achieves a state called clear, which is supposed to be an optimum state of mental, physical, and personal well-being. In the late 1960s, Hubbard then introduced even higher levels of increasingly esoteric training called the operating Thetan levels. Now, the term Thetan refers to our true spiritual self, or our true identity as an immortal spirit, and operating Thetan, or OT, means a spirit that is increasingly free from the limitations of the material universe. Eventually, whoops. Can our tech guy help me out, maybe?
Probably not.
I have my laptop.
Anyone anonymous here?
You won't be able to do anything until that's done.
Should I plug this in?
Until it updates.
You can imagine how long this is going to take.
Yeah.
Right now.
No,
Always the backup since my Facebook.
I guess. I have no idea. Because it's the first.
Sorry about the Thetan getting invaded by some Thetans or something. Okay, so we were talking about the higher levels of Scientology training called operating Thetan, or OT, which Hubbard introduced in the late 1960s. So again, the term Thetan refers to our true spiritual self, or our true identity as an immortal spirit, and operating Thetan, or OT, means a spirit that is increasingly freed from the limitations of the physical world. Eventually, an OT is said to acquire supernatural abilities or superpowers, such as the ability to exteriorize or travel outside the body, clairvoyance, telekinesis, and various others. So Scientology has a map of the spiritual path called the Bridge to Total Freedom, which is here on the right. You probably can't see it that well. But it begins basically with the lower level Dianetics stages leading up to clear, which is here, and then beyond that are the operating Phaeton levels, which become increasingly confidential. On the Church's official bridge, there are 15 of these secret OT levels, though only 8 of them have thus far been released, and it's unclear today whether the other 7 were ever completed before Hubbard's death. Now, one of the most common criticisms of Scientology is that these higher levels of confidential training become quite expensive. According to a 2009 list of fees and registration rates from the Church's Flag Services organization in Florida, which is right here. So this is a list from the Flag Services organization 2009, and the operating Phaeton costs are here in the center column, which you might not be able to see very well. But basically, the costs below the level of OT3 run from $6,800 per 12.5 hours of auditing to $56,100 per 150 hours of auditing. Then above OT3, the costs run from $7,800 per 12.5 hours to $64,350 per 150 hours. The individual OT levels themselves then, according to this list, range from $2,800 to $13,600. So the total cost to complete the OT training will vary depending on the amount of auditing that an individual Scientologist requires to move through each level. However, conservative estimates suggest that rising to OT8 would require a minimum of $350,000 to $400,000, and that's without including the various other courses, books, and materials offered, such as the latest model e-meter, various texts, recordings, and DVDs, which range in price from several hundred to several $1,000s. Now, most of the media attention has focused on just one of these operating Phaeton levels, OT3. This was leaked to the press in the 1980s and allegedly tells the story of the past history of the universe going back 75 million years. This is also called the first wall of fire, which was said to be extremely difficult for Hubbard himself to attain and purports to reveal the cause of human suffering on Earth. The main character in this tale is an evil emperor named Xenu, or Xenu in some versions of the story, and it involves a complex narrative of the Galactic Confederacy, atomic bombs, volcanoes, and other elaborate space opera details. This is also the story that was dramatized and ridiculed on the American TV show South Park in 2005, which some of you may have seen. So if you're interested, you can go to Comedy Central's website and watch it there. It's a fascinating story, and I'm happy to talk about it after my talk, but for my purposes here today, it's not the most interesting aspect of the OT materials. And in fact, it's really only the tip of the esoteric iceberg, as it were. In fact, it's in many ways a distraction from the other OT materials, which have not really been examined by anyone in any critical way, but are in fact far more controversial than the stuff that was dramatized on South Park. Indeed, the really interesting and complicated mysteries go well beyond the widely known and often ridiculed Xenu story. The most controversial of the OT levels is actually OT8, which is the last one that has thus far been released by the Church, and some would argue was the last one Hubbard completed before his death. This is also called the third and final wall of fire, which promises to reveal the ultimate truth of our existence and restore the full power of the Phaeton or spiritual self. Rather surprisingly, however, this key portion of Scientology's esoteric materials, which is supposed to be the ultimate secret of Hubbard's teachings, has still never been examined critically by any contemporary scholars. So Aaron is passing out some copies of a version of the OT8 text that appeared on a website called the Fishman Affidavit, that I'm going to talk about in a minute. So the OT8 level was completely secret until 1990, when a Scientologist named Stephen Fishman was sued for libel by the Church based on his critical statements about Scientology. In the course of the court proceedings, all of the OT materials became part of the court record, and not surprisingly, they were quickly leaked to the press and eventually onto the internet. Initially, the Church of Scientology claimed rights to all of the Fishman materials, including the OT8 text, but it then later amended its claim to exclude the version of the OT8 text in the Fishman Affidavit, claiming that it was a forgery. Meanwhile, there's also the larger question of the OT materials beyond OT8, from OT9 to 15, which have to date never been released, but which the current Scientology head David Miscavige claims to have in his possession. So let's take a look at part of the text from the OT8 materials in the Fishman Affidavit. Again, this is the material from the court proceedings and has been ruled after much litigation to be in the public domain, so we're allowed to look at it and you can easily find it on the internet. It's a fairly long document, but I want to focus our attention on just a couple of key paragraphs from the text, which is dated May 5, 1980, and is explicitly labeled confidential in capital letters. So I want to start by looking at page 2 of the handout in the section that I marked number 1. So in this text, the author seems to make the remarkable claim to be both the future Buddha, Maitreya or Maitreya, who is predicted to come at the end of this cosmic era, and to be the Antichrist of the Christian book of Revelation. So in the first section of the document, the author asserts that Hubbard is in fact the future Buddha, Maitreya or Maitreya, and this is a claim, I should note, that he had also made in a previous document from the 1950s called Hymn of Asia. So it reads here, with the exception of the original Buddhism, virtually all religions of any consequence on this planet, mono and pantheistic alike, have been instruments to speed the progress of this evolution of consciousness and bring about the eventual enslavement of mankind. As you know, Siddhartha Gautama never claimed to be anything more than a man. Having caught on to this operation, he postulated his own return as Maitreya, a part of which prophecy will have been fulfilled upon the passing of L. Ron Hubbard. So here, the text appears not only to condemn all major religions except Buddhism, but then also to identify Hubbard himself with the future Buddha, Maitreya or Maitreya. Now, if this claim were not remarkable enough, the same text also appears to identify Hubbard with the figures of Lucifer and the Antichrist. And this is the section marked 2 in the handout that I gave you. Hubbard's mission in this world, the text claims, is actually to derail or prevent the biblical narrative of Jesus' second coming described in the book of Revelation. The text also weaves the narrative of the second coming with aspects of Hubbard's space opera cosmology, such as an ancient civilization called the Galactic Confederacy, and another more sinister alien civilization called the Markabians. So it reads, no doubt you are familiar with the Revelation section of the Bible, where various events are predicted. Also mentioned is a brief period of time in which an arch enemy of Christ, referred to as the Antichrist, will reign and his opinions will have sway. This Antichrist represents the forces of Lucifer, literally the light bearers or light bringer, Lucifer being a mythical representation of the forces of enlightenment, the Galactic Confederacy. My mission could be said to fulfill the biblical promise represented by this brief Antichrist period. During this period, there's a fleeting opportunity for the whole scenario to be effectively derailed, which would make it impossible for the mass Markabian landing, the second coming, to take place. So the text goes on to make some fairly controversial criticisms of Jesus himself, who's described essentially as a lover of young boys who had an anger management problem. So in section 3 there, for those of you whose Christian toes I've stepped on, let me take the opportunity to disabuse you of some lovely myths. For instance, the historic Jesus was not merely the sainted figure he has been made out to be. In addition to being a lover of young boys and men, he was given to uncontrollable bursts of temper and hatred. And then finally, in what is perhaps the oddest portion of this document, the text concludes with a promise that L. Ron Hubbard will return in a future incarnation on planet Earth. Here the author claims that Hubbard will return to this world not simply with a spiritual mission, but also with a political one, which is really his final secret. So it reads, I will return not as a religious leader, but a political one. This is the 4th section that I highlighted there. That happens to be the requisite beingness for the task at hand. I will not be known to most of you, my activities misunderstood by many. So there you have it, the secret that I've kept close to my chest all these years. Now I want to emphasize that the Church of Scientology initially claimed ownership of all of this OT material, but then subsequently amended its claim to state that this OT8 document was a forgery. Moreover, the version of the OT8 text that was later leaked to sources such as WikiLeaks is completely different from this version contained in the Fishman Affidavit. So the status of this text, with its extremely controversial claims about Jesus, the Antichrist, and Hubbard's political role, remains quite unclear. Even ex-Scientologists who had achieved OT8 and then left the church disagree as to the authenticity of this text, some claiming that it's the original work of Hubbard and others that it's a forgery. So in one recent book, ex-Scientologist George White states that about half of the OT8 level Scientologists he interviewed said this was the real version of the text, and about half said it was fake. George White himself, I should note, claims that this is the real one he received in 1988, and this is his certificate of receiving OT8, and he says that this text with the Antichrist and Jesus' lover voice was the one that he saw. Personally, I am not an OT8 level Scientologist, so I can't pass judgment on the authenticity of the text. However, for critics who want to find continuities between Hubbard's early involvement in occultism and the later Church of Scientology that I talked about earlier, the text in the Fishman Affidavit would lend great support to the idea that Hubbard was still immersed in magic, occultism, and in the work of Aleister Crowley that we were looking at earlier in the talk. Crowley, for example, was also quite critical of Christianity, and he had also called himself by the Antichrist-like title of the Great Beast 666. Now, to make things still more complicated, as if things weren't complicated and confusing already, all of this still leaves open the question of whether there's any additional OT material beyond OT8. This would seem to be indicated in the Bridge to Total Freedom that we looked at that has 15 OT levels listed. And these would presumably be even more esoteric and more inaccessible to non-Scientologists. Today, however, it is not really known whether these upper levels from 9 to 15 even exist, not even by most Scientologists, including former high-ranking members who have recently left the church. The current Scientology head, David Miscavige, claims to have these remaining OT levels written in Hubbard's hand safely in his possession, simply waiting for the right moment to release them. And this is basically what another high-level Scientology spokesman named John Wood told me in an email exchange while I was working on this talk. But many ex-Scientologists, such as Marty Rathbun, who was the chief lieutenant under Miscavige before he left the church, claim that this is simply a lie, and that there are in fact no additional levels beyond OT8. So basically what we have here in the OT8 materials is really an extreme example of what I was calling the ethical and epistemological double-bind of secrecy. Not only is the attempt to pry into Scientology's advanced materials ethically problematic, but is also, I think we can see, a massive epistemological quagmire. I think we can justifiably examine materials that have been made part of the public court record, such as the documents in the Fishman Affidavit, yet determining their authenticity at this point seems difficult, if not impossible. Indeed, I think it's unlikely that even Scientology's current leadership could say with certainty whether the OT8 materials in the Fishman Affidavit are fraudulent or genuine, since their alleged author has been dead for 30 years, and even the current Scientology head, David Miscavige, was only 20 years old when the texts were composed and was not yet in a position of leadership. Now again, I don't think there is any simple way out of this double bind of secrecy. However, my approach here is basically twofold. First, I suggest that we sort of shift our gaze away from the content of the secret and instead to its more visible forms and strategies through which secret information is constructed, maintained, and transmitted. So this doesn't mean that the content is non-existent or unimportant, but rather that it is in many cases unknowable and or ethically problematic. Here I follow Georg Simmel's seminal insight that secrecy is a sociological form that is independent of its contents. In other words, even if we can't always say much about the content of a secret, we can still say quite a lot of interesting things about the forms through which secrecy operates, the mechanisms and strategies through which secret information is concealed, revealed, and transmitted. And then second, what I'm going to do is retrace the history of this particular secret and its strategies of concealment through 5 historical moments. So the remainder of my paper is basically going to retrace these 5 historical moments in the handling of Scientology's esoteric materials from the late 1960s to the present. So, the first key moment and strategy in the history that I'm going to retrace here is what I call the advertisement of the secret, or the public announcement of esoteric knowledge, which is something that we see throughout Scientology publications during the late 1960s and 70s. As glossy publications such as Advance magazine proudly declare, the OT levels will reveal the most secret and powerful insights into the past history of the universe, offering the keys to our spiritual liberation and the means to ever greater spiritual powers. Hubbard himself, these advertisements explain, had to struggle and suffer to pass through this wall of fire, but now we can all follow him through it to total liberation. So as we read in one promotional ad from Advance magazine, if your Dianetic clear, don't stop now, pass through the wall of fire. Man has often spoken of hellfire, but he never had to go to hell to find it. The traps of this sector of the universe have ensured that Earth would remain a hell of wars, madness, and hate. Many have tried to discover why Earth is such an inferno of insanity. No one could penetrate the wall of fire, but now you can pass through the wall of fire. L. Ron Hubbard found the key and taped out the exact path. That path is operating Clayton. Here, the secrets of this sector of the universe are revealed. Another advertisement from Advanced Magazine describes OT8 as not just the key to the secrets of the universe, but also as the means to unleash one's infinite potential as a thetan. It is simply, quote, the ultimate level, the being attains total power. In short, what these advertisements consistently do again and again is make it clear that a tremendously powerful secret exists and must be obtained without saying anything specific about what exactly it might be. So that's the first moment in the history I'm tracing here. The second moment in this history is what I call the fashioning of the secret as a kind of adorning possession, to borrow a phrase again from Georg Simmel. So as Simmel famously put it in his essay of 1906, the secret often serves as a kind of adornment which paradoxically enhances and exaggerates the status of the one who holds it precisely by virtue of what it conceals. So just as fine clothing or jewelry enhances one's status by covering parts of the body, the possession of secret knowledge can enhance one's status and prestige through its power of concealment. So in Simmel's words, the secret operates as an adorning possession. This involves the contradiction that what recedes before the consciousness of others is hidden from them, is emphasized in their consciousness, that one should appear as a noteworthy person through what one conceals. And this adorning function is often quite literal, as we see in the various OT jewelry, rings, bracelets, and pendants that Scientologists can purchase in order to signal and display their advanced OT status. In other words, it's often both a social and very material kind of adornment. In this sense, secret knowledge might also be thought of as a form of symbolic capital in Pierre Bourdieu's sense. Among other things, secrecy works by transforming a piece of knowledge into something that is a scarce resource. In Bourdieu's terms, a good that is rare and worthy of being sought after. And the possession of this scarce resource can in turn bestow status, prestige, and symbolic power upon its owner. As Bourdieu suggests, the acquisition of symbolic capital is also typically linked to an exchange of material capital, which is something we clearly see in Scientology's OT levels, which again run into the thousands and tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars. The anthropologist Tanya Luhrmann makes a similar point in her famous essay, The Magic of Secrecy, where she notes that, quote, secrecy elevates the value of the thing concealed, that which is hidden grows desirable and seems powerful. I think this was at least in part the attraction of Scientology for the many celebrities and actors who joined the movement beginning in the 1970s, such as John Travolta, Tom Cruise, Kirstie Alley, Isaac Hayes, and many others. As we see in the extremely opulent celebrity centers, such as the one in the center there in Hollywood, California, becoming a Scientologist was for many rising stars a kind of symbolic capital and adornment in both a figurative and a literal sense. That is, it was a form of status and also a means of social networking in the film and music industries. At least at its peak in the 1970s and 80s, Scientology really did provide a certain status and symbolic capital for the many actors, musicians, and entertainers involved, allowing them to enter into a network of powerful, wealthy, and well-connected individuals. Of course, as we'll see below, this is probably no longer so much the case today in 2016, as Scientology has now lost much of its symbolic power and cachet, and is now arguably, in many cases, as much a liability as a sign of status. So the third period in this history is what I call the litigation of the secret, or the transformation of the secret into an object of intense legal dispute. Beginning in the 1980s, the operating fate materials became the focus of several major lawsuits when they were leaked by ex-Scientologists and then found their way to the media and eventually onto the internet. Indeed, the church established its own Religious Technology Center, or RTC, whose stated aim is, quote, to protect the Scientology religion's trademarks and advance religious scripture. The RTC became involved in several intense legal disputes over the circulation of the OT materials, which it claims are not only copyrighted and trade secrets, but also confidential religious texts. One of the most intense of these disputes began with an ex-Scientologist named Larry Wollersheim, who filed a civil suit against the church and then later posted the confidential OT materials on his website, FactNet. The church in turn promptly sued FactNet, and in 1999 reached a settlement whose terms were that if FactNet is ever found guilty of church copyright violations, they're enjoined to pay Scientology $1 million. An equally intense legal battle surrounded the materials that were produced during the case of ex-Scientologist Stephen Fishman, which is the primary source for the OT8 documents that we just examined a little bit earlier. First produced as court exhibits in 1993, the Fishman documents became the object of intense legal debate, not only in the US, but also in the Dutch courts, when a Dutch journalist put them on the internet and then promptly faced charges that this was a violation of copyright and trade secrets. The Dutch courts, however, ruled 3 times in the journalist's favor, and so the Fishman materials and their version of OT8 remain easily accessible to anyone with internet access to this day. Various other lawsuits, both large and small, were filed against a wide array of critics, ranging from mega media empires such as Time magazine, who published a cover story on Scientology called The Cult of Greed, down to ordinary college students. One of my own undergraduate students, in fact, had posted some of the OT materials on his personal website, and then promptly received a threatening letter from Scientology's lawyers, who had his entire website and also his email service terminated. However, these aggressive tactics of litigation appear to have had little real effect on the circulation of OT materials, and have arguably backfired because they're all over the internet. It's very easy to find them. Thus, the fourth moment in this history is what I call the liability of the secret, or the gradual transformation of secret information from a source of status and power into a source of embarrassment. In Scientology's case, this began in the 1990s and 2000s as more and more of the OT materials inevitably found their way into cyberspace and began proliferating wildly. Today, a simple Google search on the keywords operating Thetan now produces about 35,000 hits, while a search on Xenu produces another 460,000 hits. Perhaps the height of this embarrassment was the 2005 episode of the cartoon satire South Park, which dramatized and mercilessly ridiculed the OT8 story about Emperor Xenu. This widespread dissemination of Scientology's secrets, I think, is in large part the reason for the church's decline in numbers in the last decade. So, according to one recent poll of religious affiliation in the United States, the church's numbers had dropped from 55,000 in 2001 to just around 25,000 in 2008. As one ex-member, Robert Von Young, put it, the internet may well prove to be Scientology's Waterloo, that is, a deeply entrenched, extremely messy, bloody, and costly battle that cannot possibly be won. Scientology's and its secret materials also became a major target of attack and ridicule by the loose collective called Anonymous, which champions free speech on the internet. In addition to protesting the church in physical space, the Anonymous group has been active in cyberspace, disseminating Scientology's esoteric materials as quickly and widely as they can. According to a video message uploaded to YouTube in 2008, the Anonymous group is dedicated to nothing less than the destruction of Scientology in its present form, and its members have been active in disseminating confidential Scientology documents as widely as possible. In fact, one anonymous member sent me over 40 DVDs and a massive hard drive filled with virtually all known documents, including texts, magazines, audio recordings, movies, ephemera, old mimeographs, FBI files, etc., ever gathered on the church. Then finally, the fifth period in this history is what I call the irrelevance of the secret, which is largely what we see today. Most ordinary Scientologists today know and care little about the advanced OT materials, and few Scientology spokespersons will ever even acknowledge that things like the Xenu story exist. In a famous interview with ABC News in 2009, for example, former Scientology spokesman Tommy Davis was asked repeatedly about the OT materials and the Xenu story. After refusing to answer any of the questions, he finally grew increasingly agitated and finally removed his microphone and walked off the set. I should note, though, that Tommy Davis later left the Church of Scientology and is now also among the ex-members. In its promotional materials and websites today, Scientology now typically emphasizes the more public and exoteric aspects of the church, such as its ability to help personal lives, build families, and further careers, as well as its outreach and charitable work, such as the volunteer ministers who help with disaster relief. While the tantalizing power of the OT materials was advertised and promoted quite prominently in publications of the 1960s and 70s, and it's all over the magazines from that period, they are now more often downplayed in favor of the more public and non-controversial aspects of Scientology. In sum, the secret itself has largely receded from the promise to reveal the deepest mysteries of the universe to a kind of embarrassing anachronism that means little to most practicing Scientologists today. So, to conclude, I want to briefly discuss the broader implications and also the limitations of the approach that I have suggested here. The focus on the forms and strategies of secrecy And this emphasis on the history of the secret, I would argue, has many comparative implications for the study of secrecy in other traditions. For example, the tactic of the advertisement of the secret is one that we see frequently in many, if not most, esoteric traditions. After all, if secret knowledge has value, that value is paradoxically only realized if its existence, though not its content, is made publicly known. The American scholar Paul C. Johnson has aptly dubbed this sort of display of esoteric knowledge secretism, that is, in his words, the active milling, polishing, and promotion of the reputation of secrets, accompanied by the promiscuous circulation of a secret's inaccessibility. I think this is much the sort of advertisement or secretism that we see in esoteric movements such as the Theosophical Society. So in its foundational text entitled simply The Secret Doctrine, Theosophy promises to reveal the divine secrets of the world's sacred traditions, though only partially and in half-veiled form. Secondly, the role of secrecy as an adornment or adorning possession is also something that we see widely in many esoteric traditions. Perhaps the most obvious example is American Freemasonry, particularly in its most elaborate and complicated forms, such as the Scottish Rite. With a wide array of fabulous robes, crowns, jewels, and scepters worn by initiates in the upper degrees, Scottish Rite Freemasonry embodies this adorning function of secrecy in both its symbolic and literal sense, that is, both as a source of status and prestige and as something that literally embodies or adorns the physical body. Third, the litigation of the secret is also a phenomenon that we see increasingly in the 21st century, as many religious movements have been forced to adopt the same structures, logics, and legal tactics as large multinational corporations. Similar legal battles have been fought, for example, over many forms of yoga, such as Bikram yoga, which also claims to hold trademarks over its sequences of postures. Another example that I talked about last night is the Osho International Foundation, which has claimed trademarks and copyrights over the works and meditation techniques of the Indian guru Osho, and indeed it has claimed rights over the name Osho itself and fought a major legal battle with a rival group that used the name Osho. It is not a stretch to imagine that these sorts of legal disputes over intellectual property, trademarks, and trade secrets may well become some of the defining issues of 21st century religious life. And then finally, what I have called the liability and the irrelevance of the secret are also common patterns that we see, particularly in esoteric movements that are undergoing a period of decline or transformation. The case of American Freemasonry is again an obvious example of this pattern. In its early development in the United States and Europe and elsewhere, Freemasonry contained a huge amount of complex occult symbolism and ritual, along with elements drawn from Kabbalah, alchemy, and Hermeticism. Yet today, Freemasonry is largely an innocuous fraternal organization in which secrecy is for the most part a curious and often embarrassing anachronism. A similar historical trajectory can be seen in the development of Mormonism in the United States from the 19th century to the present. As historian Michael Homer has recently argued, early Mormonism was deeply entwined with Freemasonry, which was a foundational element in the secret ceremonies and other key elements of the Mormon Church in the mid-19th century. Yet as Mormonism grew into an established and increasingly mainstream tradition, Mormons progressively distanced themselves from Freemasonry, downplaying or a sequence of airbrushing out the esoteric dimensions of Mormon ritual in favor of a more respectable, transparent, clean-cut, all-American public identity. Surely we could cite many other comparative examples here, such as recent work on Australian Aboriginal religions, Hindu and Buddhist Tantra, Jewish Kabbalah, and many others, but the key point I want to make is that the content of secrecy in each of these cases would obviously be very different and historically variable. Yet I think the forms and strategies through which secret knowledge is concealed, transmitted, revealed, and transformed over time may well turn out to be remarkably similar across cultures and historical periods. So this may not be sort of universal archetypes in Mircea Eliade's sense, but these may at least provide a sort of useful starting point for interest in cross-cultural comparative work. Lastly, I would want to acknowledge the limitations of the approach that I've outlined here and my focus on form and strategy rather than content in the study of secrecy. After all, one might legitimately ask, aren't there cases where the content of the secret really is important and really is knowable? For example, I mentioned at the beginning of my talk that Scientology's Guardian's Office was involved in very real acts of espionage against US government agencies such as the IRS during the 1970s. Many ex-Scientologists, such as Mark Headley, Nancy Meny, Jerry Armstrong, and others, have also accused the Church of physical abuse and human rights violations in its disciplinary program called the RPF, or Rehabilitation Project Force. To this I would answer, yes, of course, there are indeed forms of religious secrecy that require a different methodological approach, and there are many cases where focus on the hidden content would be more directly relevant. Moreover, there are also cases, for example, allegations of abuse and human rights violations, as we see in the allegations surrounding Scientology's controversial RPF program, where the role of the scholar simply leaves off, I think, and the role of law enforcement has to begin. Although I did not focus on these aspects of secrecy in my short presentation, I'd be happy to talk about them more if anyone's interested in delving into other facets of this extremely complex movement. So with that, I will stop, and I want to welcome your feedback, comments, criticisms, and open discussion. Thank you so much for your attention. So I'll open it to the floor for any thoughts, outrages, insights you might have. Yeah, go ahead.
Not outraged, totally fascinated. Thank you. It's really interesting. I know very, very little about Scientology, so something that just grabbed my attention is the figure of the auditor.
Mm-hmm.
Even in the photographs, it's just like a hand sticking out of the side of the
Right.
picture. Who are the auditors? And how are they trained? Who are
Yeah.
these people?
Yeah, that's a good question. So if we go back to the bridge to total freedom that I showed briefly earlier. So I just want to show you the image of the bridge so you can see how it works. Basically, there are two tracks in the bridge to total freedom. You can see here. This is the processing side where you go through the stages leading to clear. You clear all the negative memory traces from this lifetime. And then you go into the operating more confidential levels. This side is called the training, and this is where you are trained to become an auditor. So they go through an equally complicated series of levels. And ideally, you would work in a team. So one person would be going through auditing, the other person would be going through the training. And then when you get to the higher levels, you begin to audit yourself. When you get into the upper OT levels, you use the e-meter on yourself. That picture of Travolta there, I think is just, they were just focusing on Travolta because he's a celebrity. But they often show pictures of the auditor and auditee working together. Yeah. But there is a complicated series of training that they go through. And later, when Scientology gets into real issues with the IRS, and the IRS is revoking its tax-exempt status, they need to redefine the auditor as more like a minister because they're using more explicitly religious language. Yeah. Other questions, thoughts, observations? Yeah, in the back there.
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I especially like the last part when you're about to sum things up. You say that maybe there is a possibility of doing cross-cultural studies, like you could do maybe like compare one religion with another.
Right.
And you also mentioned that what we can see is that the content of the secret could be different, but what we can see something in common is the similar transformation of the advertising or the approach.
Right.
So my question would be that, of course, we are not promoting the certain kind of universal archetype,
Mm-hmm.
but somehow do you think there is a universal concern that, or like a universal motivation that somehow stimulates or somehow serves as a catalyst for other religions to transform or to reform the type of secret?
Right. So you're asking whether I think there is some kind of universal impulse toward secrecy and the use of secrecy in this way. Yeah, that's a great question. I've thought a lot about it because I am really interested in comparison, and I do a lot of comparison in my own work, but I guess I would say that universals are something that I, as a limited human being, can't begin to talk about because I don't know the entire span of human history or every culture there is. So I guess I shy away from speaking in terms of universals or archetypes in Eliada's sense, but I do think that on a more limited level, we can do comparison in a very useful way by teasing out these common patterns or common forms and strategies, as I call them. that can give us insights into how secrecy works in different cultures and historical periods without claiming that they're universal. I mean, it could be a universal thing, but I guess I would want to err on the side of humility and say that I don't know enough to make a claim that grandiose, if that makes sense. That's a great question, though. Other thoughts, observations, insights? It's crystal clear, I guess. Nothing to say. Yeah, go ahead.
That was, as everyone else has said, extremely fascinating. I'm still trying to wrap my mind around it a little bit.
It'll take a while to wrap your head around Scientology.
One of the things that I was curious about, because you mentioned at the beginning of your talk about this idea of even if you can access this information, should you share it? Do you
Right.
have the right to share it?
Right.
And so I guess I have kind of two questions. The
Right.
first is, what's been the reaction to your work? Have you had any interactions with people in Scientology who have been very against your work or very for your work? And then the second one is, now that I guess you finished this a few years ago, but since that time, have you rethought this idea at all in wanting to kind of focus more on the content of the secrets,
Yeah.
or if you have the same feeling?
Yeah, those are both great questions, actually really excellent questions. So first, you're asking about the reactions that I've received from Scientologists to my work, and then second, whether in retrospect I've rethought a bit. Yeah. So in response to the first question, when I was working on the book, well actually when I was approached by the press to do the book, I talked about it with my wife, and the first thing she said was, "You better get a lawyer," because there's such a well-known history of litigation from Scientologists. And so I talked about it with the press, and they had a lawyer, the press lawyer, read the manuscript with a fine-tooth comb, and she gave me over 30 pages of little things to change, like change the wording here, add another reference here, don't use this source. And that was maybe the most time-consuming part of the whole process, honestly. But in the book itself, I didn't really reveal any secrets. I only dealt with things that are in the public domain or have come out through court cases like the Fishman affidavit. So there's no secret stuff exposed there. I'm more interested in the history of the movement, how it became recognized as a religion in the United States but not in other countries, and then how secrecy has been such a controversial part of the movement. So it's really looking historically at the trajectory of the movement rather than claiming to expose the inner secrets. So when the book came out, I did get a phone call from the head of Scientology's public affairs office in Hollywood. And it's ironic because when I was working on it, I tried to contact him and he never got back to me. But and we had a really good conversation. It was kind of an intense conversation, and he disagreed with a lot of aspects of my narrative. But in the end, he was basically fine with it. So no, I haven't gotten any negative response, that at least none that has been explicitly directed at me. Then you asked whether I've rethought it a little bit in retrospect. The one issue I have thought a lot more about is allegations of violence and human rights abuses, which I talked about a little bit in the book, but kind of from a distance. And since I've talked to ex-Scientologists who have told me stories that, if they are true, I mean, I don't know if they're true or not, but if they were, it's surprising that they haven't been investigated. So I think that's a piece of Scientology that I would hope someone else would look at, because if there are abuses taking place, that ought to be examined. But I didn't really do that much in my book. Yeah, it's a good question, though. Yeah.
Just touching on that point, have you ever seen the BBC Panorama documentary from the 90s where they look at the abuses?
Scientology and me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have seen that, and I've interviewed Scientologists who claimed that they were subject to those abuses too. But on the flip side, Scientology has its version of the story too, which either is that they're lying, or that they have axe to grind because they're ex-Scientologists, or that they were misunderstanding what was going on. So, at least in the book that I wrote, I didn't try to pass judgment. I just presented both sides of the story, and kind of my aim in that book was to present the information and let the reader make up his or her mind. So yeah, I've definitely seen and heard a lot of those accounts, and like I said, it seems to me that it's kind of bizarre that they haven't been. And that, I know they've been investigated by media and journalists, but not so much by law enforcement, which is kind of strange. Those are good questions. Other thoughts, observations? Yeah.
Well,
go
I
ahead.
was just wondering if you could tell us, I know absolutely nothing about Scientology, so I was wondering if you could.
We know something now. You heard me yell out.
Actually, my question is about specifically Christian points of reference that are deployed by Scientology.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about,
Sure.
how is Scientology related to mainstream forms of Christianity? How does it sort of try to sort of deflect its members away from mainstream Christianity? How is it?
Right.
Specifically, sort of, I've never really had a chance to get my mind around the Christian content.
Right, yeah, those are great questions. So if any of you didn't hear in the back, he's asking basically about Scientology's relation to Christianity and the presence, if any, of Christian content in Scientology. So it's a complicated question. So in his early Scientology writings, Hubbard is quite critical of Christianity. He says that Scientology has most in common with Buddhism and Hinduism. And his first comparisons to religion were with Hinduism and Buddhism. And in his early lectures of the 50s, he's consistently critical of Christianity. Then what happens is the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, starts to investigate Scientology because they said they're making false claims about healing through the auditing and the e-meter. And then they got further heat from the Internal Revenue Service. Basically, they had tax exempt status, and then when the IRS began scrutinizing its finances, they decided that the profits were going to Hubbard and his family, so they stripped the tax exemption, which led to a 25-year war between 1967 and 1993 between Scientology and the IRS that involved literally thousands of lawsuits. And it's during that period that you see much more explicit deployment of Christian imagery. So the organizations become labeled churches. The Scientology cross is more prominently deployed. They started wearing ministerial collars, right? So they clearly played up the Christian-looking side of it to make the case that they were a tax-exempt religious organization. The Scientology cross actually has nothing to do with the Christian cross except appearance.
Sure.
Right? It bears most resemblance to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn's Rose Cross layman, and then Aleister Crowley used that on the back of his Thoth tarot deck, which is probably where Hubbard picks that up from. But the symbolism of the Scientology cross is it has 8 points rather than 4, which symbolize what are called the 8 dynamics, which are our urge to survive on 8 levels from the individual self up to the infinite or the divine. So there's a lot of superficial resemblance to Christianity, but in terms of content, no. But today most Scientologists will say, though, that you can be any religion and come to Scientology. So you can be Christian and come to Scientology, Buddhist and come to Scientology. Those are great questions, though. Other things you want to ask about or gripe about? Yeah, go ahead.
Do you think Scientology started as an alternative to modern psychology, and then maybe crept into the religious realm just for tax exemption? Did you ever find anything like, isn't L. Ron Hubbard, wasn't he very against modern psychiatry?
Yeah.
And this was his own kind of, his version of modern psychiatry in a way?
Yeah, that's another excellent question. So you're asking about basically why it goes from something that looks like self-help therapy or psychology toward religion. So yeah, when Hubbard wrote Dianetics, it had nothing to do with religion. It was not presented as religion. It was really just the science of the mind and his method to achieve this state called clear or optimal mental and physical well-being. And it does have a lot of resemblance to psychoanalysis. So he has 2 kinds of mind, the analytical mind and the reactive mind. The reactive mind sounds a lot like Freud's unconscious. So despite the resemblances to psychoanalysis, he was also quite critical of psychoanalysis, though. So when Dianetics kind of comes to it goes into bankruptcy in 1952, and when Scientology emerges, that's when he begins to describe it explicitly as a religion. And I think it's more complicated than just the tax exemption. I think there are multiple reasons. One is that in the course of Dianetics auditing, individuals started to recall what they believe were past lives. And so Hubbard introduced the idea of the thetan, or the spiritual self, which has multiple lives and will be reborn over and over and over again, right? So there was this kind of a spiritual dimension that crept in. And then the second was the fight with the FDA, actually before the IRS. So the FDA said that they couldn't make claims about physical healing, and so Hubbard says explicitly, okay, we won't make claims about physical healing, this is about spiritual healing. And so then the e-meter is relabeled as a tool to be used in a church confessional, right? So in part, the turn to religious language is a way of getting out of the criticisms that the FDA was making. And then it's only later, really in the 60s, that it becomes about tax exemption.
Yeah.
So it was a complicated confluence of things that led them to go in the religious direction. But the interesting thing is that Hubbard, in his policy letters, he talks about all of this quite frankly. He says at one point, this is about dealing with lawyers and the government, right? It's not going to change what we're doing. So he himself, and you can read these in letters that you can get through libraries, that this was a policy matter, not a practice matter. Yeah, it is really interesting. Anything else you wanted to ask about? Yeah, go ahead.
I was curious about some of the similarities or differences in Scientology as compared to Osho.
Mm-hmm.
Just one of the things that stuck out to me is yesterday when you were talking about Osho being connected to kind of a conspicuous consumption.
Mm-hmm.
And then here where there's all this requirement, all this monetary requirement in order to really to be a part of Scientology. I was just curious if in your own work you've thought about any of these kinds of connections or...
Yeah, I mean, it's an interest of mine that I've had since I was in graduate school. My dissertation was on the intersection between a religious group that emerged in the Calcutta area during the British colonial period and the British East India Company and the new forms of capitalism that were coming into India. So it's a theme that I've kind of come back to again and again throughout my work. It's just, I've always been fascinated in the intersection between economics and religion, because normally we don't like to put them together, and yet they're often together, right? So I've always been fascinated by that and seeing how it plays out in different contexts. In the case of Scientology, it particularly interests me because of this kind of exchange of material capital and symbolic capital that you see, this large amounts of money that are involved in the auditing, and then the kind of cachet or status that comes with that. So I've always been interested in that kind of intersection. What struck you about that connection?
I think that I was just, to me they seem a little bit different, where we were talking about Osho, it's more about this kind of either that you can afford to go to this resort,
Right.
or this fleet of Rolls Royces, all of this kind of showing a level of economic success, and that maybe it's a part of it in some way, but it's not necessarily a prerequisite to being
Right.
a part of it, or to
I see. Right.
reading Osho's works or listening to tapes or any of that.
Right.
Whereas here it seems more to me like it's a requirement. If you don't have the money, you actually cannot be a part of.
Yeah, I see the distinction you're making. I think that's a good insight and a good comparative difference. One thing I would note, though, about Scientology is there are other options if you don't have $350,000 to go through the OT levels. You can become part of what's called the Sea Organization, which it started as a kind of military order aboard Hubbard's fleet of ships. Basically, it was kind of a paramilitary, quasi-military naval order. They dressed in naval outfits and stuff. So you could be a full-time member of the Sea Organization, and that way your auditing would be covered. Or there are other ways. You can work for the church. Like I talked to one guy who was working as a secretary to pay for his auditing levels. But otherwise, though, there are these set donations and fees, and they do become quite expensive. Yeah. Good. These are all great questions. I'm happy to answer more if you have any.
If not,
Well, thank you for coming. I enjoyed talking to you.